Today we're going to be adding and subtracting radicals. We're still on lesson 11.2. It's made up of different parts. Adding and subtracting radicals is just like adding and subtracting like terms. What do I mean by like terms? Similar radicals. How do I go about them? Steps. Step number 1, simplify if needed. Step number 2, add or subtract your like radicals. Just like this, radical 2 plus 3 radical 2. Similar radicals. What is the number beside the radical 2? It's an invisible 1. So it's 3 plus 1, so it's 4 radical 2. And look at this, radical 5 minus 3 radical 6. Can you simplify radical 5? You can't, because 5 is 5 times 1. Radical 6, can you simplify? You can't, because it's 2 times 3. So this is my final answer. I cannot add or subtract them because they are not alike. The first example, 4 radical 10 plus radical 13 minus 9 radical 10. Can I simplify radical 10? It's 2 times 5. I can't. Can I simplify radical 13? It's 13 times 1. I can't. Can I simplify radical 10? Again, I can't. So I group my like radicals. 4 radical 10 and a 9 radical 10 minus 9 radical 10. Bring them together and I add and subtract my whole numbers. 4 minus 9 is a negative 5 radical 10. The 13 doesn't have a like term, so I bring it down in my answer. And this is actually my answer as it is. Negative 5 radical 10 plus radical 13, and that's it. The second example is 5 radical 3 plus radical 48. Can I simplify radical 3? I can't. So I can simplify radical 14. Radical 14 is actually radical 16 times radical 3. Radical 16 is a 4. So my answer is 5 radical 3 plus 4 radical 3. Are they alike? Yes. So I add or subtract my whole numbers. 5 plus 4 is a 9 radical 3. Did you see how I simplified? First, you always have to simplify if you can, and then you add and subtract your like terms. The third example is 2 radical 7 plus 3 radical 63. Can I simplify radical 7? I can't, because it's 7 times 1. Can I simplify radical 63? Radical 63 is actually radical 9 and radical 7. Radical 9 is a 3. What do I have here? I have 3 and a 3, so I multiply them together and I bring down my radical 7. I rewrite it again. 2 radical 7 plus 9 radical 7. Are they alike, the radicals? Yes. So I take my whole numbers, 2 plus 9, which is 11 radical 7. In adding and subtracting, I have distributing. First I distribute, then I add or subtract. Then I distribute, so it's radical 5 times 4 minus radical 5 times radical 20. 4 times a radical 5 is a 4 radical 5 minus radical 5 times radical 20 is a radical 100. Can I simplify radical 5? I can't. So my answer is 4 radical 5. Radical 100 is actually 10 minus 10. And this is my final answer. Always remember, in adding and subtracting, I'm going to have distributive and I'm going to have multiplying binomials, 2 parentheses into each other. Here I have 2 parentheses and I need to multiply them first, then add or subtract my like terms. I distribute and I distribute again. So it's radical 7 times radical 7. Radical minus radical 7 times 3 radical 2 plus radical 2 times a radical 7 plus radical 2 times minus 3 radical 2. You can only multiply your radicals with each other and the numbers with each other. Radical 7 times radical 7 is a radical 49 minus the 3 is outside, I keep it outside. Radical 7 times 2 is a radical 14. Radical 2 times a radical 7 is again a radical 14. Plus and a minus is a minus. The 3 is always outside. Radical 2 times a radical 2 is a radical 4. And now I start simplifying. Radical 49 is a 7. Can I simplify radical 14? Nope, because it's 2 times 7. I can't. What do I do? Radical 4 is actually a 2. So it's 3 times 2. I rewrite it. 7 minus 3 radical 14 plus radical 14 minus 6. Where are my like terms? I have a 7 minus 6. On the other hand, I have negative 3 radical 14 plus radical 14. 7 minus 6 is a 1. Minus 3 plus, there's no number here, so it's an invisible 1. Minus 3 plus 1 is a negative 2 radical 14. This is my answer. Did you see what we did? We first distributed and multiplied, then we started simplifying our radicals, and then we added or subtracted our alike radicals. The sixth example we have 4 minus radical 2 parentheses 5 plus radical 2. Again, I start distributing. So it's 4 times 5 plus 4 times radical 2 minus radical 2 times 5 minus radical 2 times a radical 2. 4 times 5 is a 20 plus 4 times radical 2 is a 4 radical 2. Radical 2 times 5 is a 5 radical 2 minus radical 2 times a radical 2 is a radical 4. Let's simplify. Can I simplify radical 2? I can't. Radical 2 I can't. Radical 4 is a 2. So I rewrite 20 plus 4 radical 2 minus 5 radical 2 minus 2. And I group my like terms. 20 and minus 2 are similar. And I have plus 4 radical 2 minus 5 radical 2. 20 minus 2 is 18. Plus 4 minus 5 is negative 1 radical 2. This is my answer. Now we have a radical 3 minus 2, all of this parenthesis to the second power. It's a special case. Always remember, a minus b to the second power is a2 minus 2ab plus b2. An a plus b to the second power is an a2 plus 2ab plus b2. The same goes here. So this is an a2 minus 2ab plus b2. What is the a? This is your a, this is your b. So it's radical 3 to the second power minus 2 times radical 3 times 2, don't use your signs, plus b to the second power. Radical 3 to the second power is actually radical 3 times a radical 3, which is a radical 9, which is actually a 3. Minus 2 times 2 is a 4 radical 3. 2 to the second power is a 4. And now I group my like terms. 3 plus 4 is a 7. And I have this that doesn't have a like term, minus 4 radical 3. This is my final answer for the special case. I have a 1 plus radical 12 in one parenthesis, 1 minus radical 12. What does it remind you of? 1 plus 1 minus, the same a's, the same b's. So it's an a2 minus b2. So this gives me an a2 minus b2, which is actually an a plus b and an a minus b. What do I do? Where's my a? This is my a's. So it's 1 to the second minus, this is my b. Radical 12 to the second. 1 to the second is 1 times 1, which is actually 1, minus radical 12 times radical 12, which is radical 144, which is actually a 12. So my answer is 1 minus 12, which are similar, they're whole numbers, which is a negative 11. In lesson 11.2, there is still something called conjugates. What are conjugates? Conjugates are when you have two terms with radicals in the denominator. So instead of having 3 over radical 2, I'm going to have 3 over radical 2 minus 1. This is what I call conjugates when there are two terms. And we know that radicals cannot be in the denominator. So what do? I take the opposite of the sign in the denominator. If it's a negative, I take a positive. If it's a positive, I take a negative. How do I do that? I have the first example, 9 over 2 minus radical 3. My terms are 2 in my denominator. What's my sign? A minus sign. So I take the opposite of it, which is a plus. I multiply 2 plus radical 3 over 2 plus radical 3. I multiply both the numerator and denominator. Now what do I have? I have a 9 and I have a parenthesis 2 plus radical 3, and I have 2 minus radical 3, and I have a 2 plus radical 3. What is my goal in conjugates? That I get rid of my radicals in my denominator. So if I look at the numerator, I'm going to work with the numerator on this side. I have 9, 2 plus radical 3. So it's 9 times 2 plus 9 times radical 3, which is 18 plus 9 radical 3. On the other hand, I have 2 minus radical 3 and 2 plus radical 3. What does it remind you of? Minus and a plus, 2 and a 2, radical 3 and a radical 3. A2 minus B2. So this is my denominator I'm working with on this side. So 2 to the second power minus radical 3 to the second power. 2 to the second power is 4 minus radical 3 times is actually radical 9, and then radical 9 is a 3. So my numerator is 18 plus 9 radical 3 over 4 minus 3, which is my denominator, which is equal to, I cannot add or subtract 18 and 9 radical 3, so I leave it as it is, and then 4 minus 3 is a 1. And this is my final answer. So I want you separating your page into two, doing the numerator on one side and the denominator on the other, then putting them together and seeing what you can simplify. Let's look at this example, radical 7 plus 1 over radical 7 plus radical 2. Again, it's a conjugate because it's made up of two terms with radicals and there's a sign. So I simply take the opposite. The opposite of a plus sign is a minus. So I multiply minus radical 2, radical 7 minus radical 2 over radical 7 minus radical 2. I don't change the a and the b. I just leave them as this. I only take the opposite of the sign. And now what do I have? In my numerator, I'm going to work the numerator on the side. I have radical 7 plus 1 on one side, and I have radical 7 minus radical 2. This is on one side. In the denominator, I have radical 7 plus radical 2 and a radical 7 minus radical 2. I'm going to start with my numerator. I'm going to start expanding. Open up your parentheses, distribute. Radical 7 times a radical 7. And then it's a radical 7 times a radical 2 plus 1 times a radical 7 plus 1 times a minus radical 2. And I start radical 49 minus radical 14 plus radical 7 minus radical 2. My like terms, this is a 7. Radical 14 can't be divided, radical 7 can be divided, radical 2 can be divided. So my answer is 7 radical minus radical 14 plus radical 7 minus radical 2. Let's look at our denominator. Again, it's an a2 minus b2, which is a radical 7 minus a radical 2 to the second power. Radical 49 minus radical 4, which is a 7 minus 2, which is a 5. So my final answer is 7 minus radical 14 plus radical 7 minus radical 2, nothing is alike, over 5, and this is my final answer. I cannot touch it, and I cannot add or subtract, and I cannot simplify.